brochures that are available at the front entrance, and there are also volunteer and suggestion forms. We always look for volunteers. If anyone is interested, please let us know, and we welcome suggestions as well. Our programming is fully dependent on your donations. We don't get any money from the institution, and your gate fees do not help support the Everett Center. So your tax-deductible gift could really make our home a home for all Jewish thinkers and seekers from all streams of Judaism. It's our honor and our mission to develop programs that spark curiosity, intellect, and imagination infused with our rich Jewish culture and tradition. To continue our mission and to expand our program and strengthen our community, we invite you to make a donation so that we continue to offer all the programs free of charge. There are envelopes in the front to make a donation, or you can make a donation online. If everybody could silence their cell phones or any other electronic devices, this would be the time to do it, as I would like to introduce our speaker. Elliot Cohn is the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He has been a professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies from 1990 until 2024. He also served as the school's 9th dean. He received his BA and PhD from Harvard. He taught there as well as at the U.S. Naval War College before coming to Hopkins. Elliot has written several books, most recently The Hollow Crown, Shakespeare on How Leaders Rise, Rule and Fall, The Big Stick, Limits of Soft Power, and the Necessity of Military Force, Supreme Commander, Soldiers, Statesmen, and Leadership in Wartime, Conquered into Liberty, 2 Centuries of Battle Along the Great Warpath That Made the American Way of War. He's also authored several other works on national security and military history. Elliot served in the U.S. Army Reserve. He was a director in the Defense Department's policy planning staff, led the U.S. Air Force's multi-volume study of the First Gulf War, and has served in various official advisory positions. From 2007 to 2009, he was counselor of the Department of State, serving as Secretary Condoleezza Rice's senior advisor, focusing chiefly on issues of war and peace, including Iraq and Afghanistan. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and his commentary has also appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and on major television networks both in the United States and abroad. He also co-hosts a podcast, Shield of the Republic, which you can find if you want to hear more. This is Elliot's second visit to Chautauqua. He was here 2 years ago when he opened up the week at the AMP, the week about patriotic history, or his talk was about patriotic history during the week of the future of history. So please help me welcome Elliot Cohn.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you for that welcome. It's good to see some people who were there yesterday for my lecture on Shakespeare. I'm afraid this is not going to be an amusing lecture, as I hope to some extent that was, because today I'm not masquerading as a Shakespeare scholar, but really doing what I have done for my whole career as a student of military affairs, past and present. The theme of my remarks is going to be surprise. But I want to begin by saying that although one might not think it living in the United States, we live in the middle of a world at war. The wars in Burma, Sudan, and the southern Sahel countries have killed way more people than have been killed in Gaza. That's this year alone. Cumulatively, some of the death tolls in other wars, recent wars, some of them current, are staggering. So the Syrian civil war has probably killed about 500,000 people. The Yemeni civil war, about 375,000. The relatively small war in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, about 50,000. Not to mention associated humanitarian disasters like the forced repatriation of about 1 million Afghans from Pakistan back to Afghanistan. Of course, the Gaza-Israel-Lebanon war, where tens of thousands of Palestinians, and let us not forget, Something around 2,000 or 3,000 Israelis have also been killed and wounded. And of course, Ukraine, where total casualties, military and civilian, on both sides is creeping close to the 1 million mark. War is unfortunately pervasive, and I think despite the optimistic projections of some, there's no evidence that it is diminishing, and in fact, in some ways, the reverse may be happening. Now, as I said, I want to focus on surprise because there's a conundrum. We live in a world of extraordinary transparency, particularly regarding military affairs, in an unprecedented way. If you want to follow what's going on in the front lines in Ukraine, it's extraordinarily easy. You can go to a website called Oryx, and there you will find counts of equipment destroyed on both sides, down to the very last variant of T-72 tank, which is extraordinarily accurate. Every single vehicle hit being documented. You can follow the front lines with readily commercially available overhead imagery, and not just electro-optical imagery, but infrared imagery. People use the sensors that were originally there, I think, to detect forest fires, and you can see where there's hot spots. That's where the firefights are going on. You can follow Russian and Ukrainian or Arab or Israeli telegram channels, and you will find out an enormous amount of information, not to mention YouTube, and I could go on. And yet, despite that transparency, we have, just in the last 2 years, seen extraordinary surprises, and I'm going to talk about two of them. First, the opening phase of the Russia-Ukraine war, although to some extent still relevant, and the Israel-Hamas war. Now, in the months leading up to the February 24th, 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, Western intelligence assessed that it was likely. And in some ways, that's an encouraging story, or I should say American intelligence. But as we'll see in many other respects, and perhaps in some ways in the most important respects, they got it profoundly wrong. And what I'm about to speak about reflects a year-long project that I've been engaged on with Professor Phillips O'Brien of St. Andrews University, who's one of the world's leading military historians, and we'll be publishing this in probably about 2 months on the CSIS website. So the story of American intelligence in terms of a war coming was in many ways a tremendous success. As early as December, we were describing the buildup of Russian forces along Ukraine's periphery. And by February, actually in some ways by January, we were warning very explicitly about the imminence of a Russian attack. The failures of American intelligence get lots of attention, of course, but its successes and its enormous capabilities, particularly in the areas of signals intelligence and cyber intelligence, get a lot less play, which as a former government official, I believe is a good thing. But those capabilities, together with our space-based surveillance, meant that we really were able to detect the Russian buildup in real time. And even more remarkable, we decided to systematically release much of that intelligence on a sustained basis. And the result was not just a certain degree of preparation for what happened, but also the restoration of the credibility of American intelligence following the failures of the Iraq War. So that's the good news, and it is considerable. But to be clear, not everybody believed it. In fact, most of our European allies did not believe it, which is why the French head of military intelligence was fired shortly after the beginning of the war, as were another number of other chiefs of intelligence in European countries. And I remember quite well being in Europe literally days before the war began. Most European officials, including those with access to highly classified intelligence, simply not believing that there would be a large-scale invasion. Maybe small-scale incursions, but nothing else. But the really bad news is that we, and I do include the American intelligence community, profoundly misunderstood what kind of war it would be and how it would turn out. And what I'm going to be citing is open source assessments that were made by primarily American military analysts, although, as you'll see, there is actually overwhelming reason to believe that exactly the same misjudgments were made inside the United States government by the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency. So the two titles are Michael Kaufman and Jeffrey Edmonds, an article published 2 days before the invasion, Russia's Shock and Awe, Moscow's Use of Overwhelming Force Against Ukraine. And then another one from a few weeks earlier, Samuel Charap and Scott Boston, The West's Weapons Won't Make Any Difference to Ukraine. Kaufman and Edmonds. Ukraine's military is generally understaffed and has limited familiarity with warfare designed to surprise and disrupt enemies. Its ground forces are composed of thousands of conscripts with limited experience. Russian battalion tactical groups, by contrast, are filled with more skilled contract servicemen. Ukraine's air force is dated and stands no chance against its Russian counterpart. The Ukrainian Navy is essentially a mosquito navy of small armored gunboats. And their conclusion was they would roll over Ukraine within weeks. Charap and Boston. In short, the military balance between Russia and Ukraine is so lopsided in Moscow's favor that any assistance Washington might provide in coming weeks would be largely irrelevant in determining the outcome of a conflict should it begin. Russia's advantages in capacity, capability, and geography combine to pose insurmountable challenges for Ukrainian forces tasked with defending their country. Please note, not only were these the top visible military analysts focused on Russia at the time, they still are. They are still invited to opine on television and in the news, to testify to Congress, and repeatedly to visit the White House. And in fact, you can check the visitor logs and see just how many times Sam Charap and Michael Kaufman have been invited to brief the National Security Council staff. But they were not alone. Here is the transcript of testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee on May 12th, 2022, a couple months after the invasion. It's an exchange between one of my favorite senators, Angus King of Maine, a rare independent in our world, and Lieutenant General Scott Berrier, the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I'll read you just an excerpt. General Berrier, I think the intelligence community did a great job on this issue, Senator. Senator King, General, how can you possibly say that when we were told explicitly Kyiv would fall in 3 days and the rest of Ukraine would fall in 2 weeks? You are telling me that was accurate intelligence? So we were really focused on the Russian forces at that time, and so when we backed, and we were wrong about that too, were we not? We overestimated the Russians. Well, the intelligence community did a great job in predicting and talking, and I acknowledged that at the beginning of my question. I understand that. Yes, they did. What they failed at was predicting what was going to happen after the Russians invaded. So as I look at the totality of the entire operation, I think the enormity rests on the predictions of what the Russians were going to do versus whether or not the Ukrainians were going to be successful. Well, if you do not concede there was a problem on this, then we've got a problem. For what it's worth, I'm with Senator King. I think we've got a problem, so let's look at it. The general consensus when the war began, inside and outside government, was that, as Senator King let slip, that the Russians would take Kyiv in 3 days and all of Ukraine in 2 weeks. The only question, and there was doubt about this, was whether Ukraine would launch guerrilla warfare and how long that would last. So what went wrong? Let's begin with why analysts had such a high opinion of the Russian military. Part of it was they were looking at Russian equipment, and some of the new Russian equipment was very impressive on a parade ground. Much of it, however, never made it to the battlefield, like the Armata T-14 tank. Still, the look was good. And the exercises, which could be observed, looked impressive. And even if the number of soldiers was relatively small, maybe 200,000 at most on the front lines, the amount of equipment was indeed vast. Analysts looked at the Russian army and said, well, they have professional soldiers. The technical term is contract soldiers. Actually, those contract soldiers were just conscripts who had signed up for another year. But the mistake that was made, and you'll see this falls with other mistakes, was to confuse that with professional soldiers, kind of like the military that we have. Perhaps the most interesting failure of all had to do with intellectual respect. The American analysts, and to some extent the American military, had grown up with a lot of intellectual respect for the Russian military. You may have heard of talk of a so-called Gerasimov doctrine, named after the chief of the general staff. There was a general belief that at all levels of war, this was a sophisticated, professional army organized in a particularly modern way. So what was wrong with this estimate of the Russian military? Well, it took no account of intangibles. None of the authors that we looked at took into account the pervasive corruption of the Russian military system, which has had tremendous consequences for things as mundane as replacing tires on trucks. The soldiers would frequently take the original tires off, sell them, and replace them with cheap Chinese substitutes, which ended up blowing out, to equipment like GPS systems, which were quite frequently pulled out of military gear, sold on the open market, maybe replaced with commercial receivers that could be easily jammed, maybe not. Or the fact that, as I said, this is not actually was not actually a professional army. There had been a brief period of reform in the Russian army from 2007 to 2012, where, among other things, the Russians attempted to introduce what we have and what the British have, which is a professional cadre of sergeants, non-commissioned officers, which are really the backbone of sophisticated modern militaries, and it failed. Moreover, a lot of the cliches that were invoked, like battle-hardened or battle-tested, were used by analysts to describe the Russian military because of its engagement in the Syrian civil war. And it's quite remarkable how many references there are to that conflict, without people thinking that basically what the Russian military did in Syria was bomb civilians. They did not engage in ground combat, for the most part. They were not operating in an environment where they had to worry about anti-air defenses. There were a few occasions in which they engaged in ground combat, which the most important was when the Wagner Group, which you've probably heard of, attacked a very small American outpost. And this was in, I think, February of 2018, and was wiped out. Like hundreds of Wagner operatives killed and left on the battlefield. If the Russian estimate was way too high, the Ukraine estimate was way too low. In our survey of literature, we did a very big survey of the pre-war literature. Fully 1/4 of the articles made no reference to the Ukrainians whatsoever, as if this was just about what the Russians could do. Even those that did make some mention of the Ukrainian military had almost no firsthand knowledge of it. No firsthand observation of it, certainly not knowledge of the Ukrainian language. When I had the opportunity to talk to some intelligence analysts, I said, by the way, before the war, did you talk to any of our training teams that had been working with the Ukrainians since 2014? And this was a fairly senior analyst who kind of looked at his shoes and said, well, we sent a request up, but we were told that bureaucratically it would be really complicated if we tried to talk to those officers, so we didn't. Well, some of the estimates acknowledged that Ukrainian forces had improved since 2014, when the Russians had taken Crimea, and the invasion of Donbass less than a year later. Most of that improvement was chalked up not to the Ukrainians, but to Western training. And by the way, if you looked in open sources, you would have seen actually the Ukrainians were getting to be quite good in 2015. More deeply, it was widely assumed that Ukraine was a divided nation, in which native Russian speakers would favor absorption into Russia, and the rest might not be entirely sure who they really were. Furthermore, because it was assumed, as you heard, that Ukrainian forces had no experience in or talent for maneuver warfare, they would not be able to resist, even though in some areas, particularly around Kyiv, the forested and hilly and urban terrain meant that a static fight was actually preferable from the Ukrainian point of view. So, the Russian military was overvalued, the Ukrainian military was undervalued. But what about the assessment of war itself? Let's begin with that phrase that was the title of one of the articles that I mentioned, shock and awe. Now, that's not a very useful phrase. It was coined in 1996 by an American defense analyst and came into play in the run-up to the Second Iraq War of 2003, and referred to the idea that a massive air attack could, in some measure, overwhelm and paralyze an enemy. And in some measure, it is what happened to Iraq in 1991 and again in 2003. But it was a profoundly misleading notion when applied to the Russians. Not only did it not correspond to their doctrine, their approved way of thinking about war, it didn't apply to what they were capable of. The Russian Air Force was and remains incapable of the kind of complex operations that characterized both of the Iraq wars, with hundreds of aircraft conducting synchronized complex operations with an unrelenting tempo. Indeed, to this day, it remains only marginally competent at what is known in the jargon as dynamic targeting. That is to say, the ability to see a fleeting target, something that's moving, and then bring air power into it. That's the reason why whenever I've traveled into Ukraine, which I've now done 3 times, you go on a train and you don't really worry about a Russian airplane attacking you, including when you're coming along exactly the same route as a lot of the military supplies that flow in through Poland. Russian doctrine was intellectually interesting. I can get into this, but actually was A, much more problematic than people realized, and in large measure, the Russians could not execute it. So, let me add, I guess, one other thing, which is there was baked into the assumptions that the Russian army was vast, and that it had behind the 400,000 active duty soldiers, something like about 2 million reservists. There again, we use the word reservists, and that calls into mind people who've served in, say, the United States Army Reserve or the National Guard. Anybody here been in the National Guard or the Reserve? A few of us. Who would normally, of course, serve a minimum of 30 days of active duty. Today, the average is about 50, or more often 60 to 70 days of active duty. Russian reservists do no military training whatsoever. It's just that they were at one point in the Russian army, and it could be 20 years ago, and that was all the military training they had. Finally, and most crucially, no military analyst captured or even seemed to want to understand Ukrainian will to fight. I remember talking to a very prominent analyst of Russia who had been born in that country and grown up in it, saying to me on February 20th, 2 days before the war, and I quote, "Mark my words, Zelensky is going to fly from Munich, where he was coming to speak, and go to London on the excuse that it's impossible to get back to Ukraine." Of course, a week later, Zelensky was on the streets of Kyiv saying, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." Why? So how did this happen? Let me offer propositions which have some broader application and which I think apply to the Israeli case as well. That psychology dominated expertise, sociology dominated estimation, and bad history dominated accurate history. So for students of cognitive psychology, this episode is a cornucopia of syndromes. And I'd refer everybody to Daniel Kahneman's wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a wonderful introduction to cognitive psychology. And what Kahneman, based on his work together with Amos Tversky, talk about is a variety of heuristics, analytical shortcuts that we all use, which help explain how we are persistently wrong. That's the great theme of Thinking Fast and Slow. We are wrong all the time. One is called the availability heuristic. That is to say, you overrate the things you can easily imagine. So in other words, if I were to ask you, what do you think is, a more probable danger for you, being attacked by a shark or being hit on the head by a piece of metal falling off in an airplane? Most of us would say shark attack, because we've seen the movies. And the idea of just a piece of metal falling off an airplane sounds kind of goofy. Actually, you're more likely to get killed by a piece of metal falling off an airplane and hitting you in the head. In this case, the way the availability heuristic worked is the thing that was available was numbers. Numbers of tanks and artillery pieces and infantry fighting vehicles, all of which are countable, and technology, which we're a very technological society, and assuming that that technology works. It was much harder and far more difficult to call to mind and virtually impossible to quantify the impact of poor discipline on things like maintenance, where it really counts, the consequences of not having a non-commissioned officer corps, and above all, corruption. A second psychological fallacy or heuristic that helps explain what happened is anchoring. So anchoring is when you go into a restaurant and you're looking at the wine list, and at the top of the wine list there's a bottle of wine that costs $233. You say, well, I'm not going to be that feckless and buy a $233 bottle of wine. I'll be a reasonable person and I'll get the $173 bottle of wine, which is much more modest and frugal. And the idea is and restaurants do this very deliberately, of course. They anchor you on the thing at the top of that column. So you'll be a chump instead of going for the perfectly decent $27 bottle of Cabernet or whatever. The anchoring heuristic worked here in what happened in Crimea, and to some extent what happened in Syria. And perhaps there was another kind of anchoring as well. And the Ukrainians got a lot better after 2014 in a number of ways I can talk about. And anchoring in Syria, in terms of having misunderstood that to begin with as demonstrating Russian proficiency, and perhaps a different kind of anchoring as well, assuming that the Russians could pull off something similar to what the United States pulled off in purely operational terms in 1991 and 2003. Maybe not as well, maybe not on quite as large a scale, but something similar, when in fact they were absolutely not capable of doing any such thing. So that's the psychological set of explanations. There's a set of sociological explanations as well, of which the most important is how small the community of Russian military analysts was and remains. And that's true in government as well. After the Cold War, most people, where we had a huge analytical establishment focused on the Soviet Union, that became a backwater. People shifted their attention either to the Middle East or to China. So you have a small, as it turned out, very insular community, very incestuous between government and think tanks, very limited in its background. For the most part, people with master's degrees in Russian studies, not generalist historians, and also a community that was very self-referential, where the way you got ahead was by approvingly citing the other small number of figures in the field. Not a group that welcomed, or to this day welcomes, scrutiny by outsiders and reacts, as I know from personal experience, very badly to criticism. Now, there was a different kind of anchoring in the way in which people thought about history. One thing I think has to do, and this is not just the analysts, but I think the rest of us, a tendency to think of Russia through the lens of the Second World War. This vast country with utterly limitless resources. After all, the Russians took over 1 million casualties, killed, wounded, missing, prisoner, in the opening months of World War II. But then again, in the opening months of World War II, they had an army of over 2 million people in the Western Soviet Union and another couple of million in the East. So they could take that. The Russian army in 2022 numbered about 400,000. And once they took the losses that they did, they could never really recover anything like such proficiency as they had. The Russian military in 1941 was a lot less corrupt, and the Russian industrial base was a lot better. The Russians, we sometimes forget, could not have survived World War II without American support. They required over 400,000 American trucks and other vehicles, 11,000 rail cars, but they still were able to produce the best tank in the world, the T-34, and a lot of them, just under 60,000. Russian military industry today has yet to deploy its most advanced tank and is reduced to importing vital munitions from Iran and North Korea. So the history is misleading. But bad history dominated in another way as well. Too many Russian military analysts essentially bought into a traditional Russian imperial story, which is very much Putin's story, by the way, and the one that he laid out quite openly in December and January before the war, that Russia is a triune nation. That is to say, it's a nation composed of Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, in that order, where the Ukrainians don't really exist as a people. And in this respect, they were not alone. Before the war, there were exactly 2 courses taught on Ukrainian history in American universities. One by Timothy Snyder at Yale, one by Serhiy Plokhy at Harvard. And that ignorance of history played a large role, I think, in people misunderstanding the level of resilience that Ukraine would show. All of this mattered. The surprise was not benign. Being too pessimistic had consequences, above all, in the excruciatingly slow flow of advanced weapons to Ukraine. The belief until quite late in 2022 that Ukraine was doomed, that it couldn't handle advanced weapons, and that it wouldn't make much difference. And that is why it is only now that a handful, and I do mean a handful, of F-16 aircraft are finally arriving to join the fight in Ukraine. Let me turn to Gaza. So I should explain that in December, I led a delegation of 7 or 8 national security and military experts to Israel. The group included a retired Australian Major General, who's one of 3 combat veterans that we had with us, as well as 2 veterans of the intelligence community, all of whom had been in war zones, some for quite a long time, some of whom knew Israel very well. This was an independently funded trip, although it was facilitated by the Israeli Foreign Ministry and Ministry of Defense. We were there for about a week and a half. It was extremely intense. A lot of time in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem with both active and what I would call semi-active military and intelligence officials, military commanders, some of the top Israeli journalists, the chairman of the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Security Committee, and others. We also had several days on the road, including a visit to the Gaza envelope, including Kibbutz Be'eri and Kibbutz Nir Oz. We saw that truly hideous 47-minute film that the Israelis have put together purely from footage taken by both victims and perpetrators on October 7th, from body cams, cell phones, security cameras. And then we had a whole day just going all along the Lebanese border. Back then you could go all along, we were really right up to the border, being assured by the IDF officer with us that, don't worry, they don't shoot at civilians. I don't think we would do that now. So let me begin by stating what I think is a pretty profound truth, which is October 7th was a failure at absolutely every level of the Israeli government and national security establishment. From individual soldiers on guard duty at military bases to the top of the government. A truly comprehensive failure. At the highest political levels, I think the belief that the deal with Qatar, which allowed Qatar to flow money into Gaza, had effectively neutralized Hamas, together with allowing some tens of thousands of workers from Gaza into Israel. A strategic failure in terms of the imagination of future conflict as rounds, as in a boxing match, not war, or mowing the grass, which was the preferred term. It was, by the way, what we were told is that the Israelis did not have an up-to-date plan for invading and occupying the entire Gaza Strip, that the last plan was nearly a decade old. It was an intelligence failure, the belief that Hamas could not and would not do what it did, the disregard of warnings conveyed by some of the female soldiers who were actually observing what was going on, an appalling decision to close their open source intelligence operations. So in intelligence jargon, there are different disciplines. There's signals intelligence from intercepted communications, although more than that. There's imagery intelligence, and there's open source, which in some ways is the most underrated and yet can be the most valuable source of information at all. And in the case of Gaza, there was plenty of open source information that should have made people very alarmed. It was an operational failure. The headquarters of the Gaza division, so the division, which is a large military formation that was in charge of the entire Gaza envelope, was about 5 kilometers from the border. This is the Re'im base. It was the headquarters of the Gaza division and of its 2 subordinate brigades. It was overrun, and so for 2 days, the headquarters that was supposed to be coordinating all the fighting, those soldiers were just trying to survive and get Hamas attackers out of the base. An equally damning failure. On October 7th at 3 a.m., a number of hours before the attack, there was a phone conversation between the chief of the general staff, the head of the Southern Command, and the head of the domestic security services, the Shabak, the Shin Bet. And the decision was made not to do anything. Tactical failures. When we went to Kibbutz Nir Oz, we had an extraordinary tour by one of the kibbutz members who had survived the attack and was determined to stay and rebuild the kibbutz. He turned to us at one point and said, "Not a bullet was fired by the IDF here." We met with General Cohn, who's this remarkable retired general who goes charging down to Kibbutz Nahal Oz to rescue his son, who's a diplomatic correspondent at Haaretz, Amir Tibon, said exactly the same thing. The units that reacted very quickly were the elite units, like Sayeret Matkal, which is the Israeli equivalent of Delta or SEAL Team 6. So they just ended up charging into this. So the result is that Sayeret Matkal, which I said is like Delta, our most elite force, took more casualties in one day than it had taken in 30 years. What makes this all the more astounding, of course, are the things that should have prevented it. Close surveillance of Gaza for more than half a century now, from electro-optical intelligence to signals intelligence to human intelligence, the overall quality of the IDF, which remains a good military, although very far from perfect, and the clarity of Hamas's intent, which has remained eliminationist from the beginning. I will just say parenthetically, seeing the consequences of that sort of surprise up close was really striking to me, particularly, of course, societal trauma, and I'm sure there are people here who have been to Israel since then, and that societal trauma will last, I think, forever. But a particular trauma for Israeli leaders, particularly in the IDF and the intelligence community. I knew most of the people we talked to from way back, and you can just see they're kind of way off the baseline of kind of emotional affect that I'd always associated with them. These are people who are haunted by the sense that they've failed their country and failed their people. And that's a danger because it can be very hard to think straight when you're carrying that burden. There was one of the, again, sort of stunning thing is there was a proposal put forward by the General Staff 2 days after the attack to launch an attack on Hezbollah, which would have been nuts. And it was eventually beat down by the political echelon, including Yuli Edelstein, who was quite involved in those discussions. And despite everything, it could have been worse. Hamas wanted to get as far as Hebron and Ashdod, and they nearly did. They ended up being stopped by police checkpoints where you had some very courageous police officers who were outgunned, were able to put up a fight long enough to block them. Most importantly, Yahya Sinwar, the guy who masterminded all this, expected Hezbollah to join in the war immediately. It has joined in the war, but it did so slowly. And again, that would have been something. So what explains the Israeli surprise? And again, I'll divide the explanations into psychological, sociological, and historical. So psychologically, as I've indicated, the leadership had arrived at a kind of premature closure. That is, that they thought the problem of Hamas and of Gaza had been contained, that they had bought off Hamas leaders with Qatari money and employment for about 20,000 Palestinians, and that their policy of limited strikes combined with which is the stick, combined with the carrot, had dealt with it. Hubris. Israeli leaders thought that they had gone to school on Yahya Sinwar and understood him, when the truth, and this comes out in interviews with people who had interrogated Sinwar in prison, was just the reverse. Sinwar, who was in Israeli jails for a couple of decades, spent that time mastering Hebrew and learning an enormous amount of Israeli history. And that's what he was reading, Israeli biographies, Israeli history. To some extent, this was about distraction, focused on Hezbollah, Iran, and the West Bank. But there was another psychological issue which had to do with the framing of Hamas. Now, the Israelis have always talked about Hamas as a terrorist organization, which of course is what it is. But it was also very much a military one, and that's why I think nomenclature matters. By referring to Hamas as a bunch of terrorists, well, terrorists conjure up images of people who go on a rampage in an airport or a school. But for Hamas, it's something different. This is an army, or was an army, organized into 5 brigades, 24 battalions, 30,000 fighters, a chain of command, staff and administrative functions. If you look at how they're organized, you say, that's an army. You don't think of it as simply a terrorist organization, but that is how it was framed, and I think that got in the way as well. And I have to say that the attacks were carried out from a purely professional point of view, very skillfully, particularly the elite Nukba forces, who were then followed on by regular brigades of Hamas and then by large numbers of average Gazans. The Nukba brigades, and I've seen the videos now, they kind of look and move like light infantry would. Very economical in their use of ammunition. They don't talk a whole lot. They move tactically. That's just not the way you think about terrorists. There are sociological explanations. The sociology of the IDF, which has some characteristics common to all militaries and others which are unique. One I think has to do with the success and dominance of technically derived intelligence. I think this, again, same problem as in Ukraine. If it doesn't come from some super secret source, you don't believe it. But Hamas had been very disciplined about not communicating in ways that could be intercepted. And that's why things like open source intelligence, where you see Sinwar giving these awards to a television producer who produced a series which basically laid out what they were going to do, should have set off some alarm bells. And I think that disdain for open source and political intelligence played a role here. There's another set of sociological explanations. This is an army, parts of which are extremely indisciplined. And as I've told members of my family here, during our visit, we were briefed by General Yehuda Fuchs, the very thoughtful commander of Central Command, who's just retired. And as we were walking out of his office, we go past this little antechamber, and there's an Israeli soldier lying on a couch looking at TikTok. And he continues to look at TikTok as we walk by. Said thank you to General Fuchs, and as we're walking to the bus, my 3 combat veterans erupt. And one of them, who had been a Marine with multiple tours in Afghanistan as an infantry officer, said, if that young man had been a Marine, he would have spent the next couple of months wishing he had never been born. And we then had a very interesting conversation about the importance of kind of routine discipline, which in this case would have meant jumping to your feet and standing at attention, in terms of defending yourself against surprise. And yes, there's a historical element too. The Israelis got used to dealing with a certain kind of Palestinian opponent and to a certain set of ways of dealing with them, as I mentioned, mowing the grass, carrots and sticks. They were not prepared for a strategic rupture, and even though history is nothing but a story of ruptures. And it also, I think, reflected a political belief that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was a receding element of Israel's security challenge, that the great threat now is from Iran, which is largely true, and the great opportunity is relationships with the Persian Gulf Arab states. And in fact, of course, as we discovered, the Palestinian problem remains a core element. Why did all this matter? Well, I think I don't have to explain that. So let me conclude by talking a little bit about what can be done. I think the hard thing to accept is the enduring reality of surprise. There's a wonderful study that was done of the Pearl Harbor surprise by Roberta Wohlstetter, and there's an introduction by Thomas Schelling, who's one of the great founders of game theory, who was actually a professor of mine long ago. And this is what Schelling says about surprise. Surprise, when it happens to a government, is likely to be a complicated, diffuse, bureaucratic thing. It includes neglect of responsibility, but also responsibilities so poorly defined or so ambiguously delegated that action gets lost. It includes gaps in intelligence, but also intelligence that, like a string of pearls too precious to wear, is too sensitive to give to those who need it. It includes the alarm that fails to work, but also the alarm that has gone off so often that it's been disconnected. It includes the unalert watchman, but also the one who knows he'll be chewed out by his superior if he gets higher authority out of bed. It includes the contingencies that occur to no one, but also those that everyone assumes somebody else is taking care of. It includes straightforward procrastination, but also decisions protracted by internal disagreement. It includes, in addition, the inability of individual human beings to rise to the occasion until they are sure it is the occasion, which is usually too late. Finally, as at Pearl Harbor, Surprise may include some measure of genuine novelty introduced by the enemy and possibly some sheer bad luck. So, coming to grips with that and accepting it is something that all of us, I think, find very difficult. Particularly, I might add, the kind of technocrats who inhabit our government. The Wall Street Journal recently had this TikTok on the prisoner exchange, which was a terrific diplomatic success. And there is an extraordinarily flattering depiction of Jake Sullivan, the President's National Security Advisor. The youngest, and I'll just quote that, the youngest National Security Advisor since the Camelot cabinet of John F. Kennedy. Sullivan had quietly become the most powerful holder of the role since Henry Kissinger. A policy prodigy who'd won the Rhodes, Marshall, and Truman scholarships. The 47-year-old only somewhat facetiously called himself the most rational man on the planet. Hillary Clinton, who read a Bible verse at his wedding, called him a once-in-a-generation talent. Carefully measuring the weight of each word, he could debate the minutiae of Chinese biotechnology subsidies or Iran sanctions while dissecting Ukraine's ongoing battles in Bakhmut down to the city block. Even by Washington standards of sycophancy, this is a bit much. I've met Jake Sullivan, and some of this rings true. But let's bear in mind that in late September 2023 rather, late September 2023, he had assured an audience, so in other words, 2 weeks before October 7th, the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. Now, they were able to yank the article that included those words from the online edition of Foreign Affairs, so you won't find it there. But if you have a hard copy, you will find it there. And indeed, I think the smarter you are, the more likely you are to fail prey to the kinds of failures I've described. And for sure, those who failed in these 2 cases were very, very smart. So what is to be done? Well, 3 things. First, I think, is to frame policy often in terms of insurance, the way we think about insurance. Insurance is not about predicting the future. It will invariably cost resources that could look like a waste of time or money or effort. It may mean taking unnecessary precautions, spending more on defense than you would like, and being a stickler about those just-in-case precautions that the Israelis did not take. A second thing I would say is a pervasive skepticism. We have a tendency, I think, not to put our own side, our own leaders and experts above all, through a rigorous and unabating questioning. That goes very much for the experts. The great 19th century statesman Lord Salisbury said, "No lesson seems to be so deeply inculcated by the experiences of life as that you should never trust experts. If you believe the doctors, nothing is wholesome. If you believe the theologians, nothing is innocent. If you believe the soldiers, nothing is safe. They all require their strong wine diluted by a very large admixture of insipid common sense." It's a lesson we keep on relearning. Public health experts during the COVID pandemic should have been subjected to some pretty serious questioning when they recommended shutting down schools. And the final need, I think, is for agility. Long ago, I co-wrote a book called Military Misfortunes, which grew out of a course that I taught at the Naval War College about competent militaries screwing up. Our conclusion was that the most common forms of failure, failure to learn from one's own or others' experience, failure to anticipate threats were bad enough. But the only truly lethal failure was a failure to adapt. Before war, the famous British military historian Michael Howard famously said, "All armies get it more or less wrong. Victory goes to the ones that most quickly get it right." What is true of war applies more broadly, I think. The test of our institutions, to include public health, emergency services, and schools, is not simply that they can learn or anticipate, but how flexible they can be in the face of surprise, how quickly they can adapt. In his famous memoir, The World of Yesterday, Stefan Zweig described the world before 1914 as the golden age of security. He grew up in a world that seemed extraordinarily stable and enduring. From the gold coins of the currency to the portraits of the good old Emperor Franz Josef, to the insurance policies against every possible peril, to the promotions by seniority alone in the civil service. And then he says, there was a grave and dangerous arrogance in this touching confidence that we had barricaded ourselves to the last loophole against any invasion of fate. Today, now that the great storm has long since smashed it, we finally know that that world of security was not but a castle of dreams. It goes against our natures, I think, to believe that outside forces can suddenly break in upon us and create the kind of surprise that Israel experienced on October 7th. Or that if such things happen, they have to be the fault of a few culpable officials. The problem, however, is that surprise always goes beyond that, and unfortunately it's a lesson that we keep on learning. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, after the last question, we have somebody who's saying Kaddish for a recent loss, so if we're able to keep a minion here, then we'll be able to say Kaddish. But please come up to the mic and ask your questions now.
We have time for just a couple, so. Somebody have a question for me that can't get to the mic?
Hindsight is an exact science, right? And you pointed out all the shortcomings. What's going to happen tomorrow?
Well, the point is, the question is, hindsight is an exact science. What will happen tomorrow? The point is, nobody knows. What you can do, what you can, to my mind, the fault lies not in trying to anticipate what the future is going to bring. You have to do that. The fault lies in certainty. And that was the certainty of Russian military analysts talking about Ukraine, who, those were unqualified judgments. The certainty of Israeli military commanders who in that 3 a.m. phone call didn't say, you know what, why don't we alert half a dozen Apache gunships on the runway, which, by the way, that would have been it for the Hamas attacks. That's the fault. Or the fault of, I would argue, a lot of public health officials. And I was at a university which had some of the best in the country who didn't say, well, we don't really know. And there are pluses and minuses, but we think thus and such. That's the real critical problem. The critical problem is the degree of humility with which you talk about the future. Sir.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation. I just introduced it in my question. My wife and I and grandchildren were in Israel on October 7th. Mm-hmm. So tying it to Russia, which is an area that I know a little bit about in law practice in Moscow for 10 years. I'm sorry. Last week, Eric Meyer, the journalist, gave a wonderful presentation, and he said, Putin does not bluff. When I asked him about the possibility of Putin resorting to nuclear weapons, as it plays out, it looks like Russia may be losing its control over Ukraine. And Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons several times to say, I'm not going to lose there.
Right. And has he used nuclear weapons?
Not yet, to my knowledge.
Therefore, he does bluff.
Okay. So I shouldn't stay awake at night worrying about nuclear weapons.
There are a lot of things to stay awake at night worrying about, including to some extent that. Ukraine going down the tubes, I would also stay awake at night worrying about. But Putin most definitely bluffs. I mean, they have repeatedly drawn red lines, starting with the delivery of HIMARS guided missiles, all the way up through the delivery of F-16s. You do that, and it's all over. First, they haven't delivered. But secondly, I mean, and this is where I think it gets easy for us to be bluffed. You need to sit down and look at it from his point of view. Does it make sense to use nuclear weapons? So the argument. First question is, what would you use them on? There aren't really lucrative targets for the use of nuclear weapons, and it is clear that we have threatened to actually engage directly if they do that. Let's say you do use, you're Putin and you do use a nuclear weapon. A few years down the road, what are the consequences? Well, one consequence I would be willing to bet a lot of money on would be you will be looking at Finnish nuclear weapons. The Poles are already talking about nuclear weapons. You'll probably be looking after that at Turkish nuclear weapons and at Kazakh nuclear weapons. And if you're Russian, you really don't, particularly Polish nuclear weapons, you really don't want to be going down that road. But then the other thing is, what country is Russia most beholden to? The answer is China. If you look at the bogus peace proposals that the Chinese have put forward, one of the key elements is no threat of the use of nuclear weapons and no use of nuclear weapons. That's the only part of their proposals that does not favor Russia. Why would they do that? Well, if you're China and you're looking at a world in which a great power uses a nuclear weapon, that then becomes plausible. And they would then have to begin thinking about Japanese nuclear weapons and South Korean nuclear weapons and Australian nuclear weapons and probably Indonesian and maybe Vietnamese nuclear weapons. And they want no part of that. I mean, when you're talking nuclear weapons, you're talking about a technology that's 80 years old. It's accessible to pretty much anybody. So, and the Chinese, and we know that the Chinese have repeatedly said to the Russians, no nukes. So the short answer is, I think, yes, he is bluffing. And I would say one other thing about Putin. I think the key to understanding him is this is a former KGB guy. So what do KGB guys do? They understand people's weaknesses, and they understand people's fears, and they play to them. And if you tell them, we are really scared that you would use nuclear weapons, which we have, guess what they'll begin talking about? I mean, if we told them, we are desperately afraid that you'll begin deploying tanks that are painted neon pink, I guarantee you that there would be neon pink painted tanks showing up in Red Square the next day. And so, I mean, that's part of, I think, who we're dealing with. So I think the notion that he doesn't bluff is just, I find that very unconvincing. Thanks. Sure, I'm sorry about that. I ran on a bit longer than I intended. I apologize.
I'll be brief, and thank you for an excellent presentation. Just something I'm very curious about. I believe I heard you say that on your trip to Israel, you found out about some women soldiers who had seen something or heard something.
Then, I'm sorry, some soldiers.
Some women soldiers who had seen something or heard something. So I'm very curious, what was it that they saw or heard? And is there any significance to the fact it was women as opposed to women and men or men? So, thank you.
Sure. So what the Israelis have long done is used female conscripts who are very bright and very sharp to man observation posts along the Gaza envelope, particularly to monitor things like the electro-optical system. They have these, they're basically like big telescopes. I mean, there's a lot more than that. And they were reporting things that morning, and they were reporting training exercises, and that seems, to some extent, got up the chain, but was poo-pooed. Now, some of that may have been a certain degree of sexism, and there is a fair bit of that in the IDF. Some of that, I think, though, was part of this larger concept. I think part of the problem is actually the inverse of all that, which is one feature of Israeli general officer culture, which I've seen a lot of, is cockiness and self-confidence to the point of hubris. And I think that allowed them, and you saw that in spades in 1973 as well. Because what you have to understand, at the top of the Israeli intelligence establishment, the general who's in charge of military intelligence is almost always from a special forces, special operations background. And those people tend to be very self-confident. Now, sometimes they also have the quality of being humble people. But in some cases not. The guy who actually just resigned and who, to his credit, said, I take responsibility for this, was definitely of that type. His successor is actually an extraordinarily distinguished soldier, but I've met him and talked to him, and I don't think he's that type at all. But there's that. The deepest tragedy of this is a lot of those women were captured. And they were not armed, which is already a shocker. And they were horribly abused. I'll just leave it at that.
We're just going to say Psalm 24 and then Jerry will say Patty.
Amen. Yishmei Rabbi Baruch, Amen. Maya. Rihu. Amen. Amen.
Kind of a comment question.